the most impactful thing in 2025 has got to be the birth of vibe coding. Just the idea has really dictated a lot of what happened throughout 2025. I have a love-hate relationship with this term. It was a promise ahead of its time.
Where do you think dev tooling will move in 2026 from there?
What I think they did right is they gave engineers what they wanted in the moment that they wanted it.
It proved the ecosystem that you don't necessarily need a better model to get better outcomes.
The context is king. It has to be on par with the idea of if a human was to do this task, what information would they require in order to do the job?
Welcome everyone to the first ever CodeRabbit podcast episode recorded here right from our San Francisco office. My name is Hendrik. I'm the developer advocate here at CodeRabbit, and I'm super excited because today I'm going to be joined by David, our VP of AI. Hi, David.
Hi.
Thanks for taking the time today.
Yeah, no worries.
Awesome. Well, it is January 2026, and I think there's no timelier moment than to have a little review of the crazy year in 25 that has been for AI coding, for AI code review, and make some predictions on what 26 might look like based on that. So obviously, David, you have a lot of opinions on that.
Yeah.
So I'm super grateful to have you here. I think I want to start with, chronologically going through it a little bit. And
Sure.
one moment that kind of at least for not only the builder community, but also the global politics and economics was quite impactful was the DeepSeek R1 moment. That was kind of sending a shockwave through, the world. And my question to you is, can you share a little bit about what, changed from your perspective in terms of, open models and the work that they did for all of us?
I think you could look at it from two perspectives. One was the model itself and people using that model. And there was a lot of obviously heightened level of interest suddenly in that model, and ultimately finally realizing that there are teams outside the US that are building sort of very impactful open models, right? And so there's the model itself, and ultimately, models change constantly, and the ability to make better and better models every single month, pretty much. There's like a new model in some level, either it's open source or a proprietary model that moves past where it was previously. But this was a big moment in a different way for me. From my perspective, that model sort of opened up the possibility of what an open model could do for a budget, right? So previously it was thought in order to make a model that had any capabilities even close to OpenAI or Anthropic's models, you needed a tremendous budget. You needed immense resources. Their technique and just the way that they viewed the problem and trying to think of it more from an optimization perspective, that opened up the possibility in a lot of other people's minds. So now you have people engaging in the idea of creating more open models that are more capable, who previously would have thought that's impossible. I can't possibly do that. And so I think that for me is going to be probably the lasting impact that model will have going forward. And I'm hoping we'll see more of those in the future, where another brand new idea comes out and suddenly, again, things shift, and we can imagine open models going even further and coming even closer to the best proprietary models.
Yeah, talking even more about impact, like what do you think, how did it force, for example, closed model providers to react to that?
So I think there was this notion that they were untouchable, right? That no matter what you did, OpenAI, Anthropic, Meta to a certain degree as well, and in Google, they're going to be the main purveyors of LLMs and the ability to engage with AI on some level, right? Generative AI especially. I think that opened up a crack, right? So everybody's perspective suddenly shifted, like, oh, it's not necessarily just going to be them. And again, I think from their perspective, that's like a code red kind of thing, to use Sam Altman's term or anyone else's, but that put a little fear into that, right? So to a certain degree, that can be good, right? So if you want to spur innovation, if you want to make sure that things suddenly move forward, competition is good. And so that opens up a lot of potential competition. So again, that momentum, the idea of I need to make sure I'm doing things in an efficient way, not just a way that just pours money into a problem. I think it's a good thing. Ultimately, either way, whether you believe that OpenAI is going to win or not, it's going to move things forward.
Yeah, no, super excited about the innovation that we're going to see in that space coming down the line in 26. Moving on to February 25, there was Andrew Karpathy popularizing this term vibe coding, which became super mainstream. Can you maybe give your opinion on why that spread so quickly, why it was such a fitting term, and maybe also give an opinion on how that impacted CodeRabbit as a company?
I have a love-hate relationship with this term. Ultimately, it's catchy, right? So I can see why it goes viral. And I think the other reason why it goes viral is because the notion of coding without looking at code, what does that do, right? It doesn't do a lot necessarily for an engineer necessarily, but it does a lot for people who have ideas who don't know engineering and have never built a program in their life, but they have this cool idea and they want to do something. And that's what it unlocks, right? So that's why I think that term takes off. That's why it gains virality, because it helps people identify with the idea of building something without having to be an engineer. And so that speaks to way more people, right? So obviously that's, I think, the main potential there. And it comes with a lot of caveats, right? It was a promise ahead of its time. It's the idea of it, not the reality isn't there yet. And so that's why, when you're talking about how does it impact CodeRabbit, vibe coding, or the idea of coding without necessarily looking at the code itself, opens up a world of errors, a whole new world of bugs. And we just released a report recently, right, that looking at the data of how many bugs are generated by these systems, the density of those bugs per line of code is just much, much higher. Like sometimes 3x the amount of bugs, depending on the type of bug in question, right? And so obviously that's good for us in a certain sense. You need something like CodeRabbit when you're generating so much code, especially, again, for the group that this really applies to, which is people who don't know engineering. If they want to build something and they want to release it, they're also not going to know how to evaluate that code and check it for all these little issues. And so CodeRabbit is going to become more and more of a necessity over time.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks for putting that into perspective. March Manos AI was kind of another viral moment that I remember very vividly, trying that as like one of the first long-running agents that really was doing something different, in the sense that it proved the ecosystem that you don't necessarily need a better model to get better outcomes, but this term of context engineering became a big rise. And I think there's a big parallel to what we do here at CodeRabbit. So can you give us like a picture here?
So you think about few-shot learning as sort of a degree of context enrichment, right? So I have a task, and this notion existed and was well studied, right? If I give the model examples of input output of behavior that I want, and I give it a new example, it's going to do much better than if I just gave that example directly. And people had sort of studied this very, very thoroughly. It's not much of a leap from there, but it's still an interesting conceptual leap, right? The idea that now, instead of giving a prompt with a few shot examples, I'm going to dynamically figure out the context requirements for a task, right? And make sure that that context is appropriate and optimal for that particular task. And then the model is going to, it's similar to, again, to the few shot learning. I'm going to give it what it needs to answer the question accurately. And so then you're relying less on the model's pre-trained knowledge, and you're leveraging more its ability to think and to reason and to extrapolate information based on what it knows. And so that's, I think, where, again, you're talking about tipping points, this idea of like, how do I leverage that then? And so Manus did a very interesting job. And again, the long-running agent side of things, this idea of I don't need one monolithic prompt that just does a huge amount of work. I want to make sure each system knows exactly what it's supposed to do, has exactly the context necessary, so I don't blow the context window, have it accomplish these smaller tasks, and then accumulate them at a long-running task. And so that idea, again, is a very interesting idea, right? It has a lot of consequences downstream. We use these concepts internally at CodeRabbit. And to your point, context engineering, just as a general framework, is pretty much the job, right? I mean, the job of code review, even looking at code generation, but let's stick at code review. The context is king. If I ask a human to review a PR at a company they've never worked for and don't allow them to explore the code base, to look at documentation, to look at anything, that review is not going to be able to sort of rise to the occasion and actually do a thorough job and at the level of a senior or a principal level engineer to make sure that that code is really up to standards. And so the context that you have to provide to the LLM has to be on par with the idea of, if a human was to do this task, what information would they require in order to do the job. And that's a tricky problem. And ultimately it's dynamic, right? It changes all the time. And the question becomes like, do you do it all in one go? Or do you do it in piecemeal where every single type of thing, I need to build a different context to accomplish that task? And so you really have to think of the problem holistically from the perspective like, how would I do this? And then which parts of this can I then automate and can I leverage, right? And AI can ultimately do an even better job because it doesn't get bored, doesn't lose concentration. It hasn't had too little sleep and can't sort of operate at the same level it was yesterday. And so, in a way, if you can figure that out, what information is required, and if you can figure out the optimization problem, then you unlock something that's not just human level; it actually will exceed what humans are capable of in that regard.
It's difficult though, huh?
It's extremely difficult. It's a challenging problem. It's ever changing. Models come out all the time, and you have to constantly be on top of all of this, and you're constantly evolving and making sure that you're getting that optimization problem right.
Yeah, taking that tangent and talking about more interesting agents. You already touched briefly on coding agents. Leaping a little bit forward into May 25, we had the rise of Codex and Claude Code, obviously gaining a lot of popularity. So what was the command line becoming such a crucial battleground for coding agents, and how did it change how developers using building tools these days?
So I don't know that it was strictly speaking just the command line. I feel like it was the ability to step outside this interface that sort of is constraining in a way. The IDE is meant really as an interactive viewpoint into what coding was, right? It's an engineering problem. You have the code there. You're iterating on the code. And so it makes sense as an initial foray into generative AI and coding that you would stay there because that's sort of one step away from where you currently are. But the idea, I think, of the CLI being a thing is you're interacting with it more, again, at a more human level. You're just talking to it. You're abstracting the idea that the code exists away. You're still aware of it, but you're less aware of it than you would be before. And so I think Claude Code, the way that they did it, ultimately is like one of those moments, again, of like, oh, this makes a lot more sense. For a lot of people, it's if I don't want to look at the code, if I'm doing this vibe coding thing, if I'm investing in this idea that I want to have 5 windows open, all sort of making different things and working in different problems, I can't do that in the IDE. It shouldn't live in the IDE. That would be somewhat cumbersome within the IDE. So this idea of using a CLI, I mean, this goes back to terminal days and things like this. People are very familiar with the CLI. Engineers are very familiar. So it's not too far away from sort of what we're used to. And at the same time, it gives us a lot more freedom. The system can now run commands. It makes sense to me why it's there and all this stuff, right? I still think that Claude Code was like a massive turning point in the vibe coding ecosystem because of that interface, the idea. And Codex ultimately, again, this idea of OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, like Google has now their agent system, again, which is kind of like an IDE. The idea behind leveraging LLMs to generate code is just something that makes a lot of sense, and at the end of the day, provides a lot of immediate value. And so I can see why these things sort of took off.
What do you think is the implication for code review then?
So I think it brings code review into the idea of like, can I, again, if I have my terminals open and I have all these things going, can I have code review be automatically run as part of this process? And the agent, again, is just sitting there in the background, consuming that review and then acting on it, right? And so we have our own CLI. So as a result, we see people want this. They want the ability to code in the CLI platform. And so it makes sense then that you bring review into that as well.
Actually, taking the same topic a bit further, I mean, just shortly after that Codex and Claude Code moment, we had the summer thriller with Windsurf and OpenAI and all that. And not getting into the politics here, but just thinking about, it seems like Windsurf and Cursor and these other IDEs, they do have a place in AI coding as well. What did they do especially right? And where do you think the dev tooling will move in 2026 from there?
What I think they did right is they gave engineers what they wanted in the moment that they wanted it, right? So again, LLMs are really great at coding. There's a lot of data, so they're really good at it. The idea of tab completion, right, existed previously. You're just making it much more effective. And so the market, so to speak, already exists. So you're bringing something to people that are already there. And so bringing it to the IDE makes a lot of sense. And I think bringing that technology to engineers first is the right way to go, and that's why they're super successful. There are a ton of engineers. This makes them extremely more productive than they were previously. They're able to accomplish a lot more. They're able to evaluate code a lot faster. There's a lot less just mundane boilerplate work they need to do. There's just so many benefits to these IDE tools, right? And so I can see why everybody likes using this to one degree or another. I'm still not sure, 100% convinced that we have reached the ultimate interface when it comes to what it looks like in the vibe coding world. If I just take a step out of the engineering mindset, which I think is going to live in the IDE still for quite some time, because I was listening to, I think it was Elon Musk talking about the fact that momentum, like inertia, the momentum that we have is very strong for any kind of system. So engineers exist in the IDE. I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. And so the need for systems to still be in there, in that environment, is going to exist. The CLI, again, engineers are used to being in a CLI, so I guess that interface makes a lot of sense. I don't know that we've come up with that aha moment of like the iPhone moment of like this brand new thing, this brand new interface that fits perfectly with the moment of a vibe coding kind of ecosystem. There are other ones, right? There's like Lovable in the way that they do things, and there's other interfaces for modifying UI code where you click on an item and then you type in what you want it to change to. So there's a lot of imagination that still hasn't fully come to fruition when it comes to what does this look like in the ideal case. I don't know what that is. I'm excited to see what people come up with over time. But I think from an engineer's perspective, Cursor, Windsurf, the IDE, the CLI, it makes perfect sense to me.
Okay. Interesting, because then October, Claude for the web launched, and then all of a sudden you were seeing people demos. I remember going to VapiCon, and there was like a big demo of like somebody calling their agent to like complete a ticket. So where do you see these type of dev workflows? I think that's a very interesting question. Evolve into 2026. Are we, all just going to send our Sentry logs to Claude Web and then they're going to complete it? Is that where the dev tool flow is going, and where does code review fit into that as well?
I think the web version is, again, a step into what is the ideal interface look like, right? And I'm not sure that that's it yet. I don't know if the adoption rate has indicated that we've reached, again, that aha moment. I think it makes, again, like to your point, accessibility higher, right? I don't need to be at my computer. I don't need to be in my ID or have access to a command line interface. I just send a notification out. Potentially, the thing just starts going. And so that's a really cool idea, right? So how do I make that make sense? So in a certain sense, I can look at logs. I can maybe hook things up that way. It opens up possibilities. I do think the idea of where do I see that going is into the realm of, as these systems get better and better, more and more things happen in the background. Rather than me having 5 terminals open with 5 different things working, I just basically spawn up a bunch of jobs and I just walk away, and it's accessible from anywhere. I don't need to be at my computer. I can go to a different computer and the same jobs are running. And so that makes a lot of sense.
Sounds like a dream.
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, right? If at the end of that, all 5 of those things are perfectly done, CodeRabbit reviews it, everything goes perfectly smoothly, and you integrate them in, that's great. And I do think we will get there. I still think there's, for people who are not engineers, the question is going to be like, how do they evaluate that? How do they iterate on that? What does exactly that look like, right? Because to a degree, you can think of the progression of engineering over time, right? So this idea that the English language is somewhat imperfect, imprecise, I should say. And so what do? We build something that accepts machine code because we're being very precise. And that's too hard. So we build, punch cards, and that's too difficult. So we build languages, right? We build higher and higher order languages to accomplish more and more complex tasks in a very precise way that's very, very defined, right? And very constrained. And so we're going backwards in a certain sense. We're going to English language. So in order to be able to evaluate that system and make iterations on it, I need to then look at what I prescribed and be able to figure out exactly where it may have gone wrong. And so there's going to be some I think systems that might go into, okay, I'm no longer debugging code. Now I need to debug and sort of review my prompts that go into the system. How did it go wrong? Why did it go wrong? So there's something else in there, I think, at a certain point that's going to need to come out.
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic. I'd love to dive into more. I mean, this entire day of like tracing and all the entire evolution of prompt engineering is for another episode, probably.
Yeah.
November. Google Gemini launched Gemini 3, and I think that really took a lot of leaderboards with the storm. So can you shed a little bit of light about what's special about it? What is it good at? Where maybe is it vulnerable against some of the other frontier lab models? And how does it rank maybe also for our proprietary CodeRabbit evals that we have here?
Yeah, so I think Gemini 3 was the first one that I was like, okay, Google's back in the race at this particular point. The benchmarking systems across the board, like you can obviously overemphasize on them. And like the question for me is always, how does it behave in the 90% use case of most people's day-to-day lives when they're building software? And I think you've seen the response to that being very positive. So you can see that Google has managed to chip into the market of where Claude Code and Cursor have existed, right? And I never really doubted that Google would eventually get there. I was a little surprised it took them that length of time. But in our own benchmarks, Gemini 3 performs extremely well, right? Its reasoning ability, its ability to follow instructions, its ability to have multi-hop reasoning where it has if then this maybe, and then this, and then finally this is the answer. That had been lacking if you look at Gemini 2.5 and previous versions. A lot of that just failed in our system. And so it really wasn't a viable option when it came for us for code review, for really getting at those hard to find problems, concurrency issues, memory leaks, things that even humans have a hard time reasoning through sometimes especially across larger code bases. And so, yeah, I'm really pleased to see that we have another competitor in this space, hopefully again, driving more innovation towards solving these really interesting problems. And I'm looking forward to seeing where they go with this now that they've kind of managed to figure out that initial how do I get on top of the leaderboard. Now it's how do I maintain that. Well, it's I don't think it's just a matter of data. They have a ton of data. It's a matter of how do I view the problem and how do I solve some of these issues that it's not doing well at right now. It's not always a data problem. Sometimes it's the harness. That's what Claude Code did particularly well.
So maybe quick excursion again. So how did it rank for us on code review?
It was on par with Opus and GPT 5.2, Opus 4.5. In terms of overall, like finding of the really, really tough problems, again, like those really hard ones, it was on par with those. The difference was the delivery of those comments is slightly different. Gemini is much more dense in the information that it gives. It tends to be a little bit more wanting to give really, really detailed explanations in terms of why a bug is there in a much more compact format. So it's not necessarily, I mean, you can tease some of that out and you can probably prompt specifically for that model to then get it to stop doing some of that. But as far as like a default way that it likes to think about the world, it's much more dense. Like if I look at Opus, for example, Opus is much more kind of like a developer. It's much more conversational. It's much more, we have a bug. We should probably fix this. We should do this. Much more inclusive in its language. GPT-5 and up to 5.2 is much more direct in its language. So each of them tends to have a certain personality associated with it without changing it. It's very interesting to see what different organizations have emphasized in the way that they've chosen to build their models, for sure.
December, there was big news that Anthropic acquired the JavaScript runtime bun that we love here at CodeRabbit as well. And the question kind of arose, like, what does that mean for Claude Code, and how does that change the game for open source tooling?
I think it really, I hope, gives people this notion that open source tooling is extremely important, right? It's extremely useful, and ultimately, large companies are willing to invest a lot in open source tooling. Bun is an extremely amazing project, right? And ultimately, Claude Code leverages it very, very heavily. And so it makes sense for them to want to invest a lot in that particular system. And I think if I'm thinking about tool usage in MCP and how Claude Code might use that in the future, it makes sense that Bun being a micro execution environment would make a lot of sense for. Again, LLMs are really great at generating code. So if I want to do something that I can distill down to generating TypeScript or generating some sort of piece of code and then executing that within a safe environment, I can accomplish a lot more than potentially just leveraging only MCP systems. I think that's potentially where it's going to go. But again, this is like a lot of trying to guess the future and predict the future. And so we'll see where it ends up happening. But I think it shows a lot of value and the value that open source systems create.
So do you think we'll see more open source tool acquisitions in 26?
I'm hoping that I'm not going to say like I don't necessarily think that acquisition is the only mechanism that makes sense in this regard. I think sponsoring these projects and providing value by contributing back to them, I'm hoping we see more of that. Ultimately, whether they decide to acquire other open source systems or not is really going to depend on how much they rely on them, right? And so we'll see whether other ones sort of come to the forefront, but it could happen for sure, especially in the case in AI where there's so much money floating around that people really want to make sure that whatever system they're leveraging is there for the long term, that they have a lot of say over what happens. Then you might see more of that, right?
Well, great point to mention maybe that we at CodeRabbit also have a 1 million pledge to open source tooling. So if you're listening to this and you're building something impactful, please do reach out. Just a side note.
Yeah.
Last item on my list, even though we could have talked about many more. Anthropic also donated the MCP protocol to the Linux Foundation, which I think was quite impactful in the sense that this is clearly a play for framework standardization. But then they also launched something else, Agent Skills. I think that was already in October, and which was more like a practical tooling move, but somehow people are confusing or a little bit misunderstanding these two tools. Maybe you can shed a little bit of light on like what each of them is used for and how they're going to evolve into 2026.
Yeah. So, I mean, MCP being an open protocol makes a lot of sense, right? Ultimately, there's a push towards people adopting stuff that can talk to LLMs. Let's formalize it and make it open, right? And we'll see even like how long term, again, that protocol evolves, right? As we get more and more understanding of the limitations of these systems and where they do really well, we'll see how it evolves. I think when it comes to skills versus MCP, from a high level, I like to think of MCP as a way of talking to external systems that's been formalized in a way that natural language can take care of, right? If I want to make API calls to external systems, obviously I'm not going to do that directly within the LLM necessarily, but I want to formalize that in some way. So there's been a few different ways that people have tried to do that, MCP being sort of the most ubiquitous of the ones that are available. When I think of agent skills, I think more of if I'm making a bunch of sub-agents and they have very specific tasks, what are they supposed to accomplish? And this goes back to our discussion earlier. We're talking about Manus, right? And this idea of like context engineering and having a task and then scaling the agents out to have a long-running view of what's happening. But each agent is in charge of a specific thing. By having a skill, you're able to set the context around what that system is trying to accomplish in a very, very controlled way, rather than having it be part of a large prompt where the system can potentially do a whole bunch of different things. Let's really formalize specifically what this is supposed to do. And I think when you do that, again, you can see where it messes up and fine-tune just that one aspect rather than potentially trying to wonder which part of my prompt is affecting it. But I think that of it more in that way, right? I want to control and really focus what the LLM is doing in this moment. MCP is a communication mechanism, the idea of grabbing information that then I can then transform and put into dynamic context. This is about really focusing the agent on one specific thing. So you can imagine they can play into each other. I have an agent that's specifically geared towards code review. I have an agent specifically geared towards something else. The code review agent and the other one might take the same information from MCP and look at it very, very differently because of the skills that I've sort of set up within them. So that's the way I kind of view the two systems.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I can challenge you to give me a little summary. Could you summarize 2025 for AI coding in like 1 or 2 sentences? And what would be the maybe 2 or 3 most impactful moments that maybe impacted your work or us here at CodeRabbit the most?
The most impactful thing in 2025 has got to be the birth of vibe coding and ultimately the release of things like Claude Code, right? Just the idea, even though it hasn't reached its full fruition, has really dictated a lot of what happened throughout 2025 and really has cemented things like CodeRabbit as being absolutely essential as part of the software development lifecycle. I would say things like Manus and other agentic systems. This idea of having a lot of smaller sub-agents doing tasks and then accumulating those has proven to be very effective at code generation, but also at code review.
So would you say the claim 2025 year of agents, is that true?
I would say that's very true, yes. And it's been, I think, where most effort has been placed and ultimately at the end of the day where we've seen the most evolution over the course of the year.
Speaking about vibe coding, I think this entire shift of vibe coding really rose one narrative that we've been hearing over and over again, which is that software engineering is junior software engineers are dead. Kind of, we've heard it over and over again, but I think it's important to talk about it one more time. Can you give your opinion? Do you agree? Do you not agree? Why do you not agree?
I mean, I hire people as one of my main tasks, right? And I hire interns, I hire junior engineers. I think the notion that junior engineers is dead is not the right framing. I think junior engineers who don't leverage AI, that's gone, right? This idea of coming in and just being a junior engineer and coding and learning how to do all this stuff, that expectation is just gone. You have to come in, you have to know how to leverage these tools, and you have to be willing to learn them very, very quickly. And so I would say in order to make yourself very valuable in the market is really, really understanding how to leverage these systems to their utmost. How do I use agents in a way that's very effective? How do I make it so that I can investigate a new code base very effectively, much, much quicker than I used to? Because that makes you no longer what we used to consider a junior engineer. It makes you more of a mid-intermediate level engineer in terms of your effectiveness and the amount of productivity, right? And you got to keep in mind, like, as people become more productive using these systems, it's not like companies are just going to say, oh, I'm just going to stop my productivity gains. No, we're just going to hire then more people and get more productive and get even more productive and so on, right? You have all these tools available to you now. If you want to make yourself really attractive in the market, you can go and build a lot of things right now and really showcase not just any more engineering talent, but also creativity, right? What are the other things that make an engineer really great is their ability to think outside the box when it comes to solving problems. I think of when I'm interviewing people and I'm trying to think whether someone is going to be a good fit is like, are you a builder? Do you really, really enjoy building things? Because if you do, if that sort of is the thing that makes you wake up and get going in the morning, then I know you're going to come in with that mindset, right? And that's what I'm looking for. And it's not junior versus senior. It's like, are you effective at using the systems that exist today?
Practical tip number 1, build something.
Yeah.
Do you have a number 2 or 3 that people should double down on?
It's really hard to keep up with everything that's going on, but I would say you have to be an avid consumer of as much of what's happening as possible. Getting in there and actually fooling around with it, right? Trying it out. And this goes back to the building aspect of it as well, but a lot of these systems, you need to actually experience them to understand where the limitations are so that you can be effective at using them. Because if you just always go in and use every tool in every circumstance, it doesn't make sense. It's like, and not everything is a nail just because I have a hammer, right? You gotta think what's the right tool for the right circumstance.
Great. Oh, great advice. That kind of brings us to the end of our episode here. So I would like to wrap up with maybe 3 of your best predictions on 2026.
I think code review is going to become, again, a ubiquitous necessity when it comes to your software development lifecycle. I think people who've been putting that off are going to start just understanding this is just an absolute necessity when it comes to my developers' ability to handle the amount of code that's coming through into production. As far as models go, I definitely see Google dominating a lot this year. I think that the fact that they've gotten to this point, we're going to see a lot of velocity from them and the DeepMind sort of side of things going forward. And not only in terms of the coding agents, but just the reasoning systems in general. And I think that they're going to offer a lot more available for free for people than sort of other players in the space. I'm also really looking forward to, I really hope that we see some unique mechanisms through which people can interact with these systems through AI, for AI coding, for building, right? I think there's going to be a lot of interesting things that come out this year as people think about these problems and have now more experience with them and where the limitations are. So I think I'm looking forward to seeing what people do when it comes to the mechanisms through which we interact with AI coding and building.
Well, there you have it, folks. Wishing you all a very successful 2026. Get your hands dirty, build things, and hope to see you again at the next episode. Thank you.